Kia ora and ni hao from Waka Zhang Khan. This presentation was created by Portia, Pepe, Rhiannon, Chasey, Shane, Ashley and Wainui. The case study we are focusing on is as follows. Sandy Jones is 27 years old and presented to her GP with a productive cough and pleuritic chest pain for several weeks. Sandy stated that she was overseas 3 months ago and in contact with her brother Alex when he was diagnosed with pulmonary tuberculosis or TB. Sandy's GP has referred her to the medical registrar at the emergency department. This presentation will cover the normal anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system as well as the altered anatomy and pathophysiology of the respiratory system when tuberculosis is present in the body. Normal anatomy of the respiratory system. The respiratory system is divided into two main components. The upper respiratory tract, or otherwise known as the conducting zone, is the first component. Made up of the nose, the pharynx, and the larynx, the organs of the upper respiratory tract are located outside the chest cavity. The nose is the only externally visible part of the respiratory system that is supported by bone and cartilage. The internal of the nose consists of the nasal cavity and is divided by the septum and lined with mucosa. Next are the paranasal sinuses that are cavities filled with air and also lined with mucosa. The pharynx is the next structure containing the tonsils and provides a passageway that connects the nasal cavity to the larynx, which leads to the oral cavity and then the esophagus. The larynx, otherwise known as the voice box, connects to the pharynx and the trachea and also contains vocal cords. The lower respiratory tract, or the respiratory zone, is composed of the trachea, the lungs, and all segments of the bronchial tree. The organs of the lower respiratory tract are located inside the thoracic or chest cavity. The trachea, also known as the windpipe, is a flexible tube running inferior to the larynx to divide into two bronchi, making up the bronchial tree. The walls of these are made up of C-shaped cartilage. The bronchial tree is divided into two trunks, left and right, which then lead onto the bronchi and bronchioles, which are smaller structures. Alveoli are the smallest structures that are located at the ends of the bronchioles. Next are the lungs, both left and right. The left lung is smaller, containing only 2 lobes, whereas the right lung is bigger, containing 3 lobes. After the lungs, we have the pleurae, which are membranes that line the thoracic cavity and cover the external lung surfaces. Lastly, the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped sheet of muscle involved in the respiratory system that separates the thorax or the chest from the abdomen.
Infections of the respiratory tract are grouped according to their symptom and anatomic involvement. These infections are usually begin, transfer, and self-limited. Etiologic associated with upper respiratory infections include virus, bacteria, mycoplasma, and fungi. Infections of the lower respiratory tract include bronchitis, pneumonia, and TB. These syndromes, especially TB, can be severe or fatal, although virus, mycoplasma, bacteria, and fungi can all cause lower respiratory tract infections. Bacteria such as Mycobacterium TB are dominant pathogens, accounting for a much higher percentage of respiratory tract infections. Cell damage or loss of cellular activity depends on the specific organism involved. This is an increase in both leukocyte infiltration and nasal secretions, including large amounts of protein and immunoglobulin. When the bronchiole is infected, the mucus becomes hyperemic and produces bronchial secretions. The damage to the mucus can range from simple loss of function to acute destruction of the respiratory epithelium. Air trapping develop may contribute to respiratory failure.
The Mycobacterium tuberculosis affects the upper and lower respiratory system. The lower respiratory system is mainly impacted by the suppression of the immune system. Here, the inflammation process occurs and a buildup of mucus forms. To get rid of this, a cough takes place. This is an action the body takes to get rid of substances that are irritating the air passages which carry the air a person breathes in from the nose and mouth to the lungs. This includes the epithelium and cilia which line the cartilage rings and produce mucus to trap harmful particles. The cilia promote motility of the mucus. A cough occurs when cells along the air passages are irritated and trigger a chain of events. The result is air in the lungs is forced out under high pressure. A person can choose to cough, a voluntary process, or the body may cough on its own, an involuntary process. The lower respiratory tract is affected by Mycobacterium tuberculosis through holes that are formed in the lungs. Here, two things happen. Firstly, this reduces the surface area for gas exchange and hence makes a person breathless even after slight exertion, such as walking. The damaged area can bleed and cause accumulation of a fluid called pus. This basically suffocates the lungs from the inside. Secondly, the airways that are still intact get blocked so less air moves through them. Some parts of the airway do not form holes but break down and collapse. These are seen as white fluffy areas in the diagram.
Respiratory physiology. The respiratory system has four main functions, these being 1. Pulmonary ventilation, which includes inspiration and expiration. 2. External respiration. 3. Transport of respiratory gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. And 4. Internal respiration. Within the roles of inspiration, this is where the inspiratory muscles contract, diaphragm descends and the ribcage rises. Thoracic cavity volume increases. Lungs are stretched and intrapulmonary volume is increased. The intrapulmonary pressure then drops. Air gases flow into lungs down its pressure gradient until intrapulmonary pressure is 0, thus equaling to the atmospheric pressure. Expiration. This is where the inspiratory muscles relax, diaphragm rises, and the ribcage descends due to recoil of costal cartilages. Thoracic cavity volume then decreases. Elastic lungs recoil passively, intrapulmonary volume decreases. Intrapulmonary pressure, air rises. This is where the gases flow out of the lungs down its pressure gradient until intrapulmonary pressure is 0. 3. External respiration. It is the process of gas exchange that occurs in the lungs. Oxygen enters the pulmonary capillaries, carbon dioxide leaves the blood and enters the alveoli. Factors influencing this process include the partial pressure gradients, being thickness of the respiratory membrane, surface area that is available, and ventilation, this being perfusion coupling. Transport of gases, this being oxygen transport. This is where the molecular oxygen is carried bound to hemoglobin in the red blood cells. The amount of oxygen bound to hemoglobin depends on the PO2 and PCO2 of the blood. Blood pH, the presence of BPG, and temperature. A small amount of oxygen gas is transported dissolved in plasma. Carbon dioxide transport. CO2 is transported in the blood dissolved in plasma, chemically bound to hemoglobin and primarily as bicarbonate ions in plasma. Loading and unloading of O2 and CO2 are mutually beneficial. In relation to this, accumulated CO2 lowers blood pH levels and depletion of CO2 increases pH levels.
The upper respiratory system has three functions. First is the passageway for air. Second, it defends against pathogens. Third, it warms, humidifies, and traps particles of inhaled air. The entire nasal cavity is covered with a special lining mucosa. This mucosal surface has microscopic hair structure, cilia. The entire nasal cavity also has many mucus-producing glands. The moist, mucus-covered surface of the nasal cavity traps harmful particles such as allergens or bacteria. This mucus blanket is continuously propelled backwards by millions of cilia that all beat to the same rhythm, so that the trapped particles are directed to the back of the nasal cavity. The side wall of the nose also contains structures which are rich in blood vessels and glands. They humidify, warm, and cool the inhaled air. Each side of nose takes turn to work. This is termed the nose cycle. While one side works, the other rests. The nose cycle functions to each side every 90 minutes to 4 hours. Particles such as dust, mold, fungi, bacteria, and viruses deposit on airway and alveolar surfaces. Fortunately, the respiratory system has defense mechanisms to clean and protect itself. Only extremely small particles, less than 3 to 5 microns in diameter, penetrate to the deep lung.
Respiratory zone. This is also known as the lower respiratory system. This is where the respiratory bronchioles, alveoli ducts, and alveoli sacs live. This is also the site for gas exchange, being oxygen and carbon dioxide. At the end of bronchiole lies a microscopic sac called an alveolus that holds the gases for exchange. The oxygen in the interior of the alveoli passes through the alveoli epithelial cell. The gas then traverses the basement membrane material sitting in the space between the alveoli and the smallest of blood vessels, this being the capillaries. This oxygen then diffuses through the capillary walls and through the walls of the red blood cells. The red blood cells then carry this oxygen back to the heart to be pumped to the rest of the body. Carbon dioxide travels through the red blood cell walls and through the walls of the capillaries. This waste product then moves through the basement membrane of the extracellular space. From this space, carbon dioxide goes through the membrane of the alveoli epithelial cells into the alveolar space. Here, the carbon dioxide awaits expulsion from the lungs to the air outside the body.
So as we've just seen, tuberculosis can be pretty damaging on the anatomy of the respiratory system, particularly in the lungs. So what I'd like to talk about is how the effect of the TB-infected anatomy of the lungs affects the way it functions. So, as a result of some of the scarring that occurs in TB, which happens in the latent form, which is a dormant form of tuberculosis, bacteria is breathed into the lungs where it becomes surrounded by white blood cells. What the white blood cells do is that they surround it and then it turns it into a granuloma. This is the immune system's way of containing the bacteria. And as a result, small scars appear in the lungs where these granulomas occur. What this does to the function is it alters the compliancy of the lungs. The alveoli are less surfactant, and what this causes is similar symptoms to what you see in emphysema. Because expiration is a passive process, it's harder for the lungs to expel air because of the scarring within the lungs. Another thing that can happen in result of granuloma formation is tuberculosis pleurisy. When this happens, the granuloma leaks and all the fluid goes into the lung, between the lungs, not in the lungs, between the lungs and into the chest and between the chest wall. What this causes when that fluid accumulates in that space is shortness of breath and pain when trying to breathe in. This is going to alter the way the person breathes, therefore affecting ventilation.
Hi, I will be talking about the physiology of tuberculosis in the lower respiratory system. As my classmate has before me has explained the upper respiratory and led on to the lower respiratory. I'll just touch base on the effects of TB on the lower resp. Bacterial droplets that have bypassed the mucociliary system reach the alveoli and are quickly surrounded and engulfed by alveolar macrophages. When this line of defense does not happen or does not work or is defeated, the person becomes infected with TB. The bacteria in the lungs multiply and cause pneumonia and other diseases in the lung. Along this, the most evident sign or symptom of TB is chest pain and coughing. The lungs become inflamed and this causes breathing difficulties as explained before, which will lead into stages of latency, primary disease, primary progressive disease, and extrapulmonary disease. That's the end, but